All right, so we are now into part three of four to introduction of research, where we already talked about what is research. We already talked about why do we do research, and finally we talk about how do we do research. So in this presentation, our goal is to describe and enumerate the key processes of conducting research. And to do this, we will look into different models and processes of how to do research. So in particular, we start with Franklin Wallen, we end with end with Creswell's process, of which I highly recommend to follow Creswell. But anyway, anyhow, all of the three models would have the same similarity to the general definition of Creswell on posing a question, gathering data to answer the question, and presenting an answer to the question. So that all of these models fit to the general frame. So let's start off with the research process according to Frankel and Wallen, 2007. So according to Frankel and Wallen, we start research by creating a statement of a research problem. So we know now that we have a problem, but we would want to specify that, right? So if you're able now to specify that problem, you can then ask questions or develop hypotheses to it. Because if it is not specific, then your hypotheses or exploratory questions would not be as focused as well. So we start off with stating our research problem, creating questions about it, and maybe creating some hypotheses about it, and so that you can better understand those questions and hypotheses, we then review the definitions and the literature that surrounds the issue or the problem. Following that is that we think about how do we collect data. So to answer the question of how to collect data, we want to highlight, or we kind of like describe thoroughly, how do we do sampling, who from whom do we get our data from. And when we talk about instrumentation, these are your tools to gather data. Example of instruments would be observation protocols, interview protocols or interview questions. You also have survey questionnaires, scales, rubrics, and so on and so forth. So these are your tools now to gather your data. Now, if you have specified that, described that, and probably compiled that, then you try to think about how do I go about the data collection. That's how you answer procedures. Procedures would give you your guide on how to do your data collection. Now, once you did collect your data, of course, considering that you also did some ethical procedures to make sure that your data collection processes are humane and are um, generally acceptable in its ethical standards. So now that you're done with your data gathering procedures, then you analyze your data. And once you analyze your data, you can then write your final report and disseminate the answer to your question. So it's kind of like going full circle from the statement of research problem and then exploring questions or hypotheses, definitions, review of literature, sampling and instrumentation, procedures, data analysis, and dissemination. So that's the research process according to Frankel and Wallen. As you can see, we can actually subdivide this ladder thing into three major parts. You have asking a question, you have data collection, and then answering the question. See? All right. So let's talk about a different model that is from Kothari, which is kind of like a little bit more extensive and complicated to look at. But if you can see, what I like about this is that you define your research problem and then you review your literature. Now, what is the difference between this and that of Frankel and Wallen? In Frankel and Wallen, you have your problem and then you ask questions. But in Kathari's model, you define your research problem specifically by reviewing the literature before you create your objectives or formulate your hypotheses for that matter. Now, Kuthari is making use of a different terminology called design the research. So when you say design the research, it talks about what Frankel and Wallen would coin as sampling, instrumentation, and procedures. So that's basically s- very similar, right? So what's the key difference here is that the literature review happens on the first, primarily first and the second part of the research process. So finally, I would like to explain this, which we will be explaining in a more extensive manner in a little while. This is from Creswell, and this is the research process cycle. Just like Othari, Creswell intended the process to be a cycle rather than a linear progression, like Frankel and Wallen. But again, Frankel and Wallen, it can also be construed as a cycle. It's kind of like going up and then going back down and going up. But Othari and Creswell really like immediately had to make it as a cyclical process. And we start off by identifying a research problem. After identifying a research problem, you review your literature. So as you can see, they're very similar in how Kotari started the process. And then by then, it's now kind of like clearer that you need to specify a purpose. And now see, what I like about how Creswell phrases his steps is that the purpose not only identifies your objectives, but also your hypotheses. See, now we kind of like combining our understanding from Frankel and Wallen and Kotari. So following the specification of the purpose of the research, we then collect data. And part of the data collection, according to Creswell, is sampling. See, selecting individuals to study, that's sampling. Obtaining permissions, that's ethical procedures and gathering information. And finally, after that, you gather your data, you analyze and interpret the data, and you report and evaluate your research. Now, reports and research evaluations would also lead other researchers to identify another research problem. So that's how we build on the research. So that's why we need to review the literatures first, because from the literatures, we can see certain research gaps that would be helpful for us to be able to specify problems. All right. So that's the research process. So the next set of slides, I'm just going to go through it because they are simply descriptors of each of those steps that I was discussing from Creswell: identifying a research problem, reviewing the literature, specifying a purpose for research, collecting data, analyzing and interpreting data, and finally reporting and evaluating research. So these are the steps. And in the next few slides, we're going to kind of like go over each of the steps and give each of those steps a more rich descriptions. Maybe I will not dwell with it in a very long time, but I'm just going to go over the slides so that you would know and understand how to do each part. All right. So the first part is identifying a research problem. Here, identifying a research problem consists of specifying an issue to study, developing a justification for studying it, and suggesting the importance of the study for select audiences. That would probably read your report. By specifying a problem, you limit the subject matter and focus attention on a specific aspect of study. So consider the following problems, each of which merits research. Say, for example, teens are not learning how to connect to others in their communities, or teenage smoking will lead to many premature deaths. These are very broad issues. But from these broad issues, you can actually take an aspect of it and limiting that subject matter, developing a justification for why this is important, and then you can present probably doable research. Next is that these needs, issues, or controversies arise out from an educational need expressed by teachers, schools, policymakers, or researchers, and we refer to them as research problems. You will state them in introductory sections of a research report and provide a rationale for their importance. Part of what Creswell would suggest as the research process is to review literature. Now, why do we need to review literature? Because it is important to know who has studied the research problem that you plan to examine. You may fear that you will initiate and conduct a study that merely replicates prior research. We don't want that. But there is specific research that are aims to simply replicate. We call them replication studies. Reviewing the literature means locating summaries, books, journals, and index publications on a topic, selectively choosing which literature to include in your review, and then summarizing the literature in a written report. Now, review of literature is not a copy and paste document where this you copy from this person and copy from that person that author copy. No, it's not. It is a critical synthesis of what is being said about an issue or topic. When we say synthesis, it's a cohesive whole. It's not a patchwork, right? Where you patch this author, patch that author, and so on and so forth. So I hope we're clear on that. Now, how do we specify purpose for research, right? So the purpose of research is that it's kind of like the overall objective or intent of your research. So it's kind of like the most important statement in your research. It's kind of like the thesis statement of your thesis. That doesn't sound right. But yeah, that's it. So the purpose statement contains the major focus of the study, the participants in the study, and the location or site of inquiry. So this purpose statement is narrowed to research questions or predictions that you plan to answer in your research study. So predictions, these are hypotheses, right? These are hypotheses. Right. Now, so we go into collecting data. So evidence, of course, helps provide an answer to your research questions and hypotheses. And to get these answers, you engage in a step of collecting or gathering data. Collecting data means identifying and selecting individuals for a study, that's your sample, obtaining their permission, that's ethical procedures, and gathering information or collecting the data by asking the people questions or observing their behaviors. A paramount concern in this process is the need to obtain accurate data from individuals and places. So this step will produce a collection of either numbers or words. When we collect numbers, we are referring to quantitative studies that mostly in a form of test scores, frequencies, or perception levels, or whatever. Words like responses, opinions, quotes most probably happens when you do qualitative study. Or you can have both numbers and words in a mixed methods research. Now, once you identify these individuals and places, you write a method or procedure into your research studies. Now let's go into analyzing and interpreting the data. During or immediately after data collection, you need to make sense of the information supplied by individuals in the study. Analysis consists of taking the data apart, kind of like really breaking it down and making sense of it to determine individual responses and then putting it back together to summarize everything. Analyzing and interpreting the data involves drawing conclusions about it, representing it in tables, figures, and pictures to summarize it, and explaining the conclusions in words to provide answers to your research questions. You report analysis and interpretation in sections for research report, usually titled Results, Findings, and Discussions. Now, finally, reporting research. Now, after conducting your research, you develop a written report and distribute it to select audiences so that they can use your information. Because our purpose, again, to doing research in education is to add to our knowledge, improve practice, and inform policy debates. So, giving or disseminating your research findings would be very, very helpful. Reporting research involves deciding on audiences, structuring the report in a format acceptable to these audiences, and then writing the report in a manner that is sensitive to all readers. The audiences for research may vary from academic researchers who contribute and read journal articles to faculty advisors and committees that reviews master's theses and dissertations to personnel in educational agencies and school districts who look for reports for research on timely topics. All right, last, we are now in the last step. How do we evaluate research? Evaluating research involves assessing the quality of a study using standards advanced by individuals in education. Unfortunately, there are no ironclad standards for evaluating educational research in the academic research community, or even in school districts or fit in a region or our nation in general. However, we still need some means of determining quality of studies, especially published research or reports presented to practitioner audiences. Now, you see, especially when you start developing your review, I'll be asking you to go into reputable research journal repositories and not just scour the internet of however you wish, right? So that also involves the kind of quality of papers and articles that we see online so that we would be sure that they're kind of like up to the standard. So that's why we will be requiring you to look into specific repositories, not just anywhere on the internet. So we end on that note. That is the process of doing research. And I would like us to be most familiar with the process of Creswell because that will be our guide for the course. Or you can even just recall Frankel and Wallen. Frankel and Wallen has 7 steps. And I think that is 7 steps. And Tothari has a very complicated look about that model, but Creswell, 6 steps by Creswell is definitely easy to remember. So please do so and do well.